The silence in the millionaire's mansion was deafening. Not a whisper could be heard, not even the faint hum of electricity flowing through the walls. Leonard Blackwood had built his fortune selling souls to technology, but somewhere along the way he had sold his own. I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're sitting in an empty room, staring at a photograph of someone who's no longer here. Or perhaps you're remembering a time when your heart still believed in miracles. It doesn't matter what hour it is, but I promise you, today's story will touch the deepest corners of your soul. Leonard Blackwood stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan, watching the city of Chicago stretch endlessly before him like a glittering carpet of broken dreams. The autumn wind rattled the glass, but inside, the air remained still, trapped, suffocating, heavy with the weight of memories he couldn't escape. His reflection stared back at him, a ghost of the man he used to be. At 52, his hair had turned silver at the temples, and deep lines etched his face like scars from battles fought in boardrooms and stock exchanges. The mansion around him was a monument to his success, marble floors imported from Italy, crystal chandeliers that cost more than most people's homes, and walls lined with priceless art that no one would ever see. His investment portfolio included everything from tech startups to cryptocurrency holdings worth millions in Bitcoin. His net worth had reached astronomical figures, with assets spread across real estate, stocks, and private equity funds that generated passive income while he slept. Yet, none of it mattered anymore. The numbers on his bank statements felt as cold and lifeless as the marble beneath his feet. 2 years had passed since Margaret died. 2 years since the woman who had been his anchor, his reason for building this empire, had slipped away from him in a sterile hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and broken promises. The cancer had taken her slowly, methodically, like a cruel accountant calculating the exact price of his happiness. He had thrown every dollar of his fortune at the disease. The best doctors, experimental treatments, medical facilities that looked more like luxury hotels than hospitals. But money, he discovered, couldn't buy miracles. It couldn't buy back the sound of her laughter echoing through these halls or the warmth of her hand in his as they watched the sunrise over the lake. Now, the clocks throughout the mansion had all stopped at 3:47 a.m., the exact moment she had taken her last breath. He couldn't bear to hear them ticking, marking the passage of time that was moving him further away from her memory. The silence had become his companion, his punishment, his prison. He moved through the vast rooms like a specter, surrounded by wealth that felt more like a curse with each passing day. Leonard had built his empire from nothing, starting with a small software company in his garage when he was barely 22. His innovations in artificial intelligence and data processing had revolutionized entire industries. Companies fought to license his patents, investors begged to fund his ventures, and financial magazines featured him on their covers as the wunderkind of Silicon Valley who had conquered Chicago's tech scene. His IPO had made headlines when his company's stock price soared, creating overnight millionaires among his employees and establishing him as one of the youngest billionaires in America. But success had come at a price. The long hours, the constant pressure, the weight of making decisions that affected thousands of employees and millions of shareholders. It had all taken its toll. The car accident 3 years ago had left him dependent on a wheelchair, his spine damaged in ways that the best surgeons claimed were irreversible. Margaret had stood by him through it all, her love unwavering even as his body failed him. She had been his legs when he couldn't walk, his voice when words failed him, his heart when his own had grown cold with disappointment and pain. The penthouse felt more like a mausoleum than a home. Every surface gleamed with the polish of expensive cleaning services, but there was no life in the perfection. The kitchen remained untouched except for the housekeeper's weekly visits. The library, once filled with Margaret's favorite novels and poetry books, now gathered dust behind glass doors he never opened. Even the master bedroom had become a shrine, her clothes still hanging in the closet, her perfume bottle on the nightstand, her reading glasses folded neatly beside a book she would never finish. Leonard spent his days managing his portfolio from his study, watching numbers fluctuate on multiple screens that displayed his various investments. The cryptocurrency market alone had made him millions in recent months, but the profits felt meaningless. He could buy and sell companies like playing pieces in a board game, but he couldn't buy back a single moment with the woman he loved. His wealth had become a barrier between him and the world, a fortress that protected him from getting hurt again, but also from ever feeling truly alive. The view from his windows told two different stories. To the east, Lakeshore Drive gleamed with the traffic of the wealthy Gold Coast neighborhood, where luxury cars glided silently between manicured parks and exclusive boutiques. But if he looked west, beyond the immediate gleam of prosperity, he could see the older neighborhoods where Chicago's working class lived, areas where people struggled to pay rent while he debated which of his vacation homes to visit for the weekend. The contrast had never bothered him before Margaret's death. Now it felt like a mirror reflecting the emptiness of his existence. Some evenings he would sit in his wheelchair by the fireplace, staring at the cold ashes from fires he no longer bothered to light. The silence would press against him like a physical weight, and he would find himself talking to Margaret's photograph, telling her about his day as if she were still there to listen. The staff had grown accustomed to his solitude, moving through the mansion like ghosts themselves, careful not to disturb the fragile ecosystem of his grief. About 20 blocks southwest of Leonard's penthouse, in a neighborhood where gentrification was slowly creeping in but hadn't yet erased the character of old Chicago, lived a little girl whose name was Mia Rodriguez. She was 9 years old, with dark hair that caught the sunlight like silk, and eyes that seemed to hold depths of understanding far beyond her years. Despite living in a cramped apartment above Rosita's Cafe, where the smell of fresh tortillas and strong coffee filled the air from dawn to dusk, Mia possessed something that Leonard's billions couldn't buy: an unshakable faith in the goodness of human nature. Mia's mother, Rosa, worked 3 jobs to keep them afloat. She cleaned office buildings downtown during the early morning hours, worked as a seamstress in a factory during the day, and helped her elderly neighbor Mrs. Chen with grocery shopping and cooking in the evenings. Rosa was a pragmatic woman, her faith in miracles worn thin by years of struggling to make ends meet. She had emigrated from El Salvador when Mia was just a baby, carrying nothing but hope and determination in her heart. That hope had been tested repeatedly by the harsh realities of American life: language barriers, discrimination, and the constant stress of financial insecurity. Their apartment was small but filled with warmth that Leonard's mansion lacked entirely. Colorful tapestries hung on the walls, plants thrived on the windowsills, and the sound of neighborhood children playing in the courtyard drifted through their windows like music. Rosa had taught Mia to find joy in simple things: the way morning light painted patterns on their kitchen table, the satisfaction of helping neighbors with their groceries, the comfort of sharing a meal even when there wasn't quite enough food to go around. Mia had started selling hugs on the street corner near the Gold Coast boundaries because she noticed how sad the well-dressed people looked as they hurried past her neighborhood. While other children might set up lemonade stands or sell candy, Mia had instinctively understood that what people needed most couldn't be bought or sold. It could only be given freely. She would stand on the corner of State Street and Division, wearing her best dress despite its faded fabric and careful patches, holding a small cardboard sign that read simply, "Free hugs, donations welcome." Most people walked past without a second glance, but those who stopped were inevitably transformed by the encounter. Mia had an almost supernatural ability to see through facades, to recognize the loneliness hiding behind expensive suits and designer handbags. She never judged or questioned why someone needed a hug. She simply opened her arms and provided what they needed. A stressed businessman rushing to catch the L train would find himself slowing down, accepting her embrace, and walking away with tears in his eyes. An elderly woman struggling with shopping bags would discover that Mia's small arms could somehow carry the weight of much more than groceries. Rosa worried constantly about these encounters. In her experience, wealthy people rarely helped children like Mia without expecting something in return. She had seen too many stories of kind gestures that turned into exploitation, of trust that was betrayed by those who had power over the powerless. But Mia insisted that her calling was real, that she could feel people's pain like physical weight, and that sharing hugs was the only way she knew to help carry their burdens. The first time Leonard saw Mia, he was taking one of his rare excursions outside the mansion. His physical therapist had insisted that he needed to leave the penthouse occasionally to prevent his muscles from completely atrophying and his spirit from disappearing entirely. He had his driver take him through different neighborhoods, and as they passed through the area near Rosita's Cafe, Leonard spotted the small figure standing on the corner. Something about her stillness in the midst of the city's constant motion caught his attention. She wasn't aggressive like other street vendors, shouting or waving signs to attract customers. Instead, she stood with quiet dignity, her sign held carefully in small hands, her expression patient and welcoming. When their eyes met through the window of his luxury sedan, Leonard felt something stir in his chest, a recognition he couldn't name, a connection that defied logic. He instructed his driver to stop, and for several minutes he watched Mia interact with passers-by. A teenage boy with torn sneakers accepted her hug and left a crumpled dollar bill in her donation box. An elderly man in a janitor's uniform stopped to pat her head gently before continuing on his way. Each interaction seemed to transform both Mia and the person she embraced, creating ripples of kindness that spread invisibly through the neighborhood. Leonard found himself returning to that corner again and again over the following weeks, parking his car at a distance where he could observe without being noticed. He told himself it was curiosity, perhaps even anthropological interest in studying the dynamics of poverty and charity. But deep down, he knew it was something else entirely, a hunger for the kind of authentic human connection that his wealth had inadvertently destroyed. Watching Mia was like glimpsing a world he had forgotten existed, a realm where value wasn't measured in dollars or market capitalization, but in the simple act of caring for one another. The autumn air was particularly crisp the afternoon. Leonard finally approached Mia directly. He had dismissed his driver and was navigating his wheelchair along the uneven sidewalk, struggling with the urban terrain that his luxury vehicles normally helped him avoid. Mia noticed his difficulty immediately and rushed to help, her small hands steadying his chair as he maneuvered around a crack in the pavement. "Are you okay, mister?" she asked, her voice carrying a lilting accent inherited from her mother, but softened by years in Chicago schools. Her concern was genuine, untainted by the calculating expressions Leonard was accustomed to seeing from people who recognized his wealth and influence. "I'm fine," Leonard replied automatically, the words he'd been saying for 2 years whenever anyone asked about his condition. But as Mia looked into his eyes with that unflinching clarity that only children possess, he found himself adding, "Actually, no, I'm not fine at all." Mia nodded as if this was the most natural confession in the world. "Most people aren't," she said simply. "That's why I sell hugs. Sometimes that's all anybody needs, just to know they're not alone in being not fine." She gestured to her cardboard sign with the pride of an entrepreneur presenting a business plan. "Would you like one?" "A hug, I mean. There's no charge, but donations help me and my mama buy groceries." Leonard's first instinct was to laugh, not from amusement, but from the absurdity of the situation. Here he was, a man whose opinion could move stock prices and whose investment decisions affected pension funds and retirement accounts across the country, being offered a hug by a 9-year-old girl on a street corner. The incongruity was almost overwhelming. His world was built on contracts and negotiations, on calculated risks and strategic partnerships. The idea of purchasing comfort through physical affection seemed both innocent and somehow profoundly naive. "I don't think I need a hug," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "I'm not really a touchy-feely kind of person." This was another automatic response, a shield he had developed over years of maintaining professional distance in boardrooms and investor meetings. Physical contact in his world was limited to firm handshakes and the occasional pat on the back when deals were closed successfully. But Mia was undeterred by his resistance. She studied his face with the intensity of a scientist examining a particularly interesting specimen. "You look really, really sad," she observed matter-of-factly. "Like my mama looked when we first came here and she missed her family back home. Except your sad looks older, like it's been living inside you for a really long time." The accuracy of her observation caught Leonard off guard. He had spent months perfecting a facade of stoic professionalism, attending board meetings and investor calls with the same composed expression he had worn before Margaret's death. His therapist, his doctors, even his closest business associates believed he was handling grief with admirable strength and resilience. Yet this child had seen through his carefully constructed mask in a matter of seconds. "My wife died," he found himself saying, though he hadn't planned to reveal anything personal. The words emerged without his permission, drawn out by something in Mia's patient presence. 2 years ago, cancer." Mia's expression softened with compassion that seemed impossibly mature for someone her age. "I'm sorry," she said, and Leonard could tell she truly meant it. "Death is really hard. My abuela died before we moved here, and Mama still cries sometimes when she thinks I'm not looking. But she told me that people we love don't really go away. They just become invisible helpers, watching out for us from somewhere else." The simplicity of her theology struck Leonard more powerfully than any of the complex philosophical discussions about mortality he had engaged in with grief counselors and spiritual advisors. Mia's faith wasn't intellectual, it was instinctive, woven into her understanding of the world like gravity or the changing seasons. She spoke about death and love and continuing connections with the casual confidence of someone who had never learned to doubt the fundamental goodness of existence. "I still don't think I need a hug," Leonard said, but his tone had softened considerably. The wall he had built around himself was developing cracks, and something warm was beginning to seep through the barriers he had carefully constructed. "That's okay," Mia replied with a shrug that indicated she had no intention of pressuring him. "But if you change your mind, I'll be here tomorrow too, and the day after that. My mama says I'm really good at waiting and really good at hugging, so I've got both bases covered." Her smile was radiant, completely free of the calculation or manipulation that characterized most of Leonard's human interactions. As Leonard wheeled away from their encounter, he felt something shifting inside his chest, not physically, but emotionally. It was as if a gear that had been rusted in place for 2 years was finally beginning to turn again. The sensation was uncomfortable, almost painful, like blood returning to a limb that had been asleep. But underneath the discomfort was something else, a tiny spark of curiosity about what tomorrow might bring. That evening, Leonard sat in his study, surrounded by multiple computer screens displaying real-time market data from around the world. His portfolio had gained another $2 million during the trading day, profits from a cryptocurrency investment that had exceeded even his most optimistic projections. But instead of feeling the satisfaction that such gains used to provide, he found his thoughts returning to a 9-year-old girl who sold hugs for grocery money and spoke about death with the wisdom of someone 3 times her age. He pulled up the security footage from his building's cameras, scrolling through different angles until he found the street corner where Mia conducted her unusual business. Even on the grainy black-and-white monitor, there was something luminous about her presence, something that made the ordinary sidewalk seem charged with possibility. Leonard watched as she interacted with various passers-by, noting how her posture remained open and welcoming even when people ignored her or walked past without acknowledgement. The next morning, Leonard instructed his driver to take a different route that would pass by Mia's corner. He told himself it was simple curiosity, a wealthy man's anthropological interest in observing how the other half lived. But as they approached the familiar intersection, Leonard found his heart rate increasing in a way that had nothing to do with his medical condition. When he spotted Mia in her usual position, wearing the same faded dress but with a new homemade sign that read, "Hugs available here," Leonard realized he'd been looking forward to seeing her again more than he cared to admit. This time, he had his driver parked nearby and waited to see if Mia would notice his presence. It didn't take long. Her dark eyes scanned the street with the alertness of someone accustomed to reading the mood of her environment, and when she spotted the luxury sedan, her face brightened with recognition. She waved enthusiastically, as if they were old friends reuniting after a long separation. Leonard found himself waving back, a response that surprised him with its spontaneity. In his carefully orchestrated world, even casual gestures were usually calculated for maximum strategic advantage. But there was something about Mia's uninhibited friendliness that bypassed all his professional defenses and connected directly to parts of himself he had forgotten existed. Over the following days, their pattern became established. Leonard would have his driver slow down as they passed Mia's corner, and they would exchange waves like participants in some secret ritual of mutual recognition. Sometimes, Leonard would see her successfully embracing other customers: a harried mother juggling shopping bags and a screaming toddler, a college student who looked like he hadn't slept in days, an elderly woman who moved slowly with the help of a walker. Each interaction seemed to energize Mia rather than drain her, as if she gained strength from giving comfort to others. Leonard began to notice changes in his own behavior that he couldn't entirely explain. He started opening the blinds in his penthouse each morning, allowing natural light to penetrate the spaces that had been shrouded in artificial twilight for months. The sensation of sunlight warming his skin felt foreign, but not unpleasant, like rediscovering a pleasure he had abandoned. He found himself eating lunch at the kitchen table instead of his desk, taking time to taste food rather than consuming it mechanically while reviewing financial reports. Most surprisingly, Leonard began to hear sounds that had been absent from his life for years, not just the acoustic details of his environment, but something deeper. The hum of the city penetrated his isolation: distant sirens, car horns, the rumble of the L train, the chatter of people walking past his building. These sounds, which he had previously filtered out as urban noise, now seemed like evidence of a living world that existed beyond his fortress of grief. One particularly gray October afternoon, when the wind off Lake Michigan carried the promise of early winter, Leonard made a decision that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. Instead of having his driver simply slow down near Mia's corner, he instructed the man to park and help him out of the vehicle. The physical effort of transferring from the car to his wheelchair on the uneven street was considerable, but Leonard was determined to have another conversation with the girl who had somehow begun to matter to him. Mia spotted him approaching and immediately abandoned her post, hurrying over to help navigate his wheelchair around the various obstacles that made urban mobility challenging for someone with his physical limitations. Her assistance was offered without fanfare or pity, simply practical help, delivered with the same matter-of-fact kindness she showed to everyone. "I've been watching you," Leonard said, realizing immediately how awkward that sounded. "I mean, I've been driving by and watching how you work, your business." He gestured toward her cardboard sign, trying to find words for something that defied his usual vocabulary of profit margins and market analysis. "I know," Mia replied cheerfully. "I've been watching you too. You look a little less sad than the first time we talked. Not all the way better, but like maybe you're thinking about maybe getting better someday." Her assessment was delivered with the casual precision of a financial analyst discussing quarterly projections, except her metrics were emotional rather than monetary. Leonard found himself genuinely curious about her perspective. How can you tell? How do you know what people are feeling just by looking at them? Mia considered the question seriously, tilting her head as if consulting some internal reference manual. "I think it's because I pay attention to the quiet parts," she said finally. "Like, most people are really loud on the outside, talking and moving and wearing fancy clothes and stuff, but really quiet on the inside. But the inside quiet is where they keep their true feelings. And if you listen really carefully to the inside quiet, you can hear what people actually need." This explanation struck Leonard as remarkably sophisticated, not because it was intellectually complex, but because it represented a way of understanding human nature that his business education had never addressed. In corporate environments, success depended on reading external signals, market trends, competitor strategies, investor sentiment. But Mia was describing a completely different kind of literacy, one that focused on emotional authenticity rather than strategic positioning. "What do you hear when you listen to my inside quiet?" Leonard asked, genuinely curious about her assessment. Mia studied him with the same intense focus she had shown during their first encounter. "You're really good at being alone," she said thoughtfully. "Like, really, really good at it. You've been practicing being alone for so long that you've almost forgotten how to be with other people. But underneath all that practice, your inside quiet is really, really loud. It's screaming about how much you miss somebody." The accuracy of her observation was almost physically painful. Leonard felt exposed, as if this child had somehow gained access to thoughts and feelings he had worked hard to keep hidden even from himself. But instead of feeling violated by her insight, he felt oddly relieved. Someone had finally seen through his carefully constructed facade and acknowledged the reality of his loss without trying to fix it or minimize it or offer empty platitudes about time healing all wounds. "My wife," Leonard said simply. "I miss my wife." Mia nodded with the grave understanding of someone who had encountered this particular form of pain before. "That's the hardest kind of missing," she agreed, "because you can't fix it by calling them or visiting them or sending them letters. That kind of missing just has to live inside you until you figure out how to make it part of the love instead of part of the hurt." Leonard stared at her, amazed by the wisdom contained in such a small package. "How do you know about things like that? About loss and grief and making hurt into love?" "My mama taught me," Mia replied matter-of-factly. "She's really good at being sad and being strong at the same time. And Mrs. Chen upstairs, she lost 3 husbands, and she told me that love doesn't stop when people die. It just changes shape, like water when it becomes steam. Still water, just different." For the first time in 2 years, Leonard felt something that might eventually become hope. Not the immediate healing or magical transformation that grief counselors had promised, but something more realistic and therefore more trustworthy. The possibility that his pain might someday evolve into something he could carry without being crushed by its weight. "Would you like that hug now?" Mia asked gently, as if she could sense that something fundamental had shifted in their conversation. Leonard looked down at this small girl who had somehow managed to see straight through to the core of his suffering and offer exactly what he needed most. Not false comfort or easy answers, but simple human connection. For reasons he couldn't fully understand, he found himself nodding. Mia's embrace was nothing like the perfunctory physical contact of his business world. Her arms wrapped around his shoulders with surprising strength, and for a moment, Leonard felt held not just by a child, but by something larger. A force of pure compassion that seemed to emanate from her like warmth from a fire. The hug lasted only a few seconds, but in that brief interval, Leonard experienced something he had thought was lost forever. The sensation of being truly seen, understood, and accepted exactly as he was. When Mia released him, Leonard felt tears on his cheeks. He couldn't remember the last time he had cried, not even at Margaret's funeral, where his grief had been too overwhelming for tears. But these tears felt different, not desperate or despairing, but somehow cleansing, like the first rain after a drought. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion he hadn't expected to feel. "You're welcome," Mia replied with a smile that seemed to encompass not just their interaction, but the entire complicated, beautiful, heartbreaking experience of being human. "Tomorrow I'll be here again, if you want to practice being not alone some more." As Leonard returned to his car, assisted by his driver and watched over by Mia until he was safely inside, he felt something stirring in his chest that he was almost afraid to name. It wasn't healing. That would take much longer, if it was even possible. But it was movement, a shifting of tectonic plates that had been locked in place for too long. For the first time since Margaret's death, Leonard found himself genuinely curious about what tomorrow might bring. That evening, Leonard made another unprecedented decision. Instead of eating alone at his kitchen table while reviewing market reports, he called Rosa's cafe and ordered dinner for delivery. When the food arrived, enchiladas and rice and beans prepared with care rather than precision, Leonard realized he had forgotten what a home-cooked meal could taste like. Each bite carried flavors that spoke of tradition and family, and the kind of love that couldn't be purchased at any price. As he ate, Leonard found himself thinking about Mia's comment about love changing shape after people die. For 2 years, he had experienced Margaret's absence as a constant, agonizing reminder of everything he had lost. But what if Mia was right? What if his grief contained within it all the love he had felt for Margaret, compressed into a form so dense it had become painful to carry? The thought was both terrifying and intriguing. Leonard wasn't ready to let go of his pain. In some ways, it was the last connection he had to the woman who had meant everything to him. But perhaps letting go wasn't the goal. Perhaps the goal was transformation, finding a way to carry love forward instead of being buried beneath its weight. Leonard spent much of that night awake, not from insomnia, but from a strange new energy that made sleep feel less necessary than it had in months. He found himself walking through his penthouse, actually walking, using the cane for support, but covering more distance than he had attempted since the accident. The rooms that had felt like a mausoleum began to reveal themselves as simply spaces waiting to be filled with life again. By morning, Leonard had made a decision that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. He was going to invite Mia to visit his home, not as a charity case or an object of anthropological study, but as a friend. The idea terrified him almost as much as it excited him, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Mia had something to teach him about the difference between existing and living. When he arrived at her corner that afternoon, Leonard found Mia engaged in conversation with an elderly man who was explaining something about bird migration patterns. She listened with complete attention, asking questions that revealed both curiosity and genuine care for her conversation partner. When she spotted Leonard approaching, her face lit up with the kind of unguarded happiness he had forgotten could exist. "I have a question for you," Leonard said after exchanging greetings and noting that the elderly man had left with a considerably lighter step than when he had arrived. "I live in a very big, very quiet house, and I was wondering if you might like to visit sometime. Maybe bring your mother, if she'd be comfortable with that." Mia's expression grew thoughtful, and Leonard could see her considering the invitation from multiple angles. "Would it be okay if I brought something? Like cookies or something? My mama always says you shouldn't visit people empty-handed." The fact that she was concerned about proper etiquette for visiting someone who could buy and sell the entire neighborhood struck Leonard as both heartbreaking and profoundly touching. Here was a child who owned virtually nothing but was worried about having something to share with someone who had everything. "You don't need to bring anything," Leonard assured her. "Just yourself. That would be more than enough." But even as he said it, Leonard realized that Mia had already brought him something invaluable, a reminder that connection between human beings didn't require contracts or negotiations or strategic alliances. Sometimes it required nothing more than the willingness to see another person clearly and offer them exactly what they needed most, whether that was a hug, a conversation, or simply the knowledge that they weren't alone in their struggles. The logistics of arranging the visit proved more complicated than Leonard had anticipated. Rosa was understandably suspicious of a wealthy stranger's sudden interest in her daughter, and Leonard found himself in the unfamiliar position of trying to prove his good intentions to someone who had no reason to trust him. It took several conversations, mediated by Mia herself, before Rosa agreed to accompany her daughter to Leonard's penthouse for what she insisted on calling just a quick hello and some juice. The day of their visit, Leonard found himself more nervous than he had been before any board meeting or investor presentation. He had his housekeeper prepare fresh flowers for every room, stock the kitchen with foods that might appeal to a child, and ensure that every surface gleamed with cleanliness. But as the appointed time approached, Leonard began to worry that his home would feel cold and unwelcoming to visitors who were accustomed to environments filled with warmth and family energy. When Rosa and Mia arrived, escorted by the building's concierge and wearing their best clothes despite the obvious difference in quality compared to Leonard's usual guests, Leonard felt a moment of panic about the vast cultural and economic gulf between their worlds. But Mia's immediate and unguarded delight at seeing the view from his windows quickly dispelled his concerns. She pressed her face against the glass, marveling at the sight of Lake Michigan stretching endlessly toward the horizon, and her excitement was so infectious that even Rosa's skeptical expression began to soften. "It's like being inside a cloud," Mia announced, turning away from the windows to explore the rest of the penthouse with the uninhibited curiosity of someone who had never learned to be intimidated by luxury. She examined his expensive artwork with the same careful attention she paid to everything else, asking questions about the paintings that revealed an intuitive understanding of color and emotion, even if she lacked formal artistic education. Rosa remained more guarded, perching carefully on the edge of Leonard's Italian leather sofa, as if prepared to leave at the first sign of trouble. But when Leonard offered her coffee and mentioned that he had specifically ordered beans from a supplier who worked directly with farmers in El Salvador, her surprise was evident. The gesture was small, but it demonstrated that he had been paying attention during their brief conversations, that her comfort mattered to him as more than just a means of gaining access to her daughter. As they shared coffee and juice and cookies that Leonard had ordered from a bakery famous for their traditional Latin American recipes, something remarkable began to happen. The vast penthouse, which had felt like a tomb for months, began to fill with sounds that Leonard had forgotten could exist in his home. Laughter, conversation, the gentle clink of dishes being used for their intended purpose rather than as decorative objects. Mia's presence seemed to activate elements of the space that had been dormant, bringing life to rooms that had been preserved like museum exhibits. "Your house is really beautiful," Mia said seriously, as she examined a crystal sculpture that had been a wedding gift from Margaret's parents. "But it feels like it's holding its breath, like it's waiting for someone to tell it that it's okay to be alive again." Another of her uncannily perceptive observations, delivered with the matter-of-fact tone of someone commenting on the weather. Leonard realized that she was absolutely right. His home had become a shrine to a life that no longer existed, every object frozen in place as a monument to loss rather than a foundation for whatever might come next. "My wife used to fill this place with music," Leonard found himself saying. "She played piano, and she would sing while she cooked dinner, and she had friends over all the time. There was always something happening, always noise and activity and life." Rosa's expression softened as she recognized the universal language of grief that transcended cultural and economic boundaries. "My mother used to say that houses need time to heal too," she offered quietly. "When someone dies, the house grieves along with the people, but eventually, the house wants to be happy again, even if the people aren't ready yet." The conversation that followed was unlike anything Leonard had experienced in years. Instead of the strategic discussions that characterized his business interactions or the careful therapeutic explorations of his grief counseling sessions, this was simply three people sharing stories about loss and love and the complicated process of figuring out how to continue living when life had fundamentally changed. Rosa told them about leaving everything she knew behind to come to America, about the pain of missing family members she might never see again, but also about the hope of building something new for Mia. Leonard found himself describing Margaret in ways he hadn't been able to articulate even to his therapist, not just as the woman he had lost, but as the person who had helped him understand what it meant to love something more than success or money or professional achievement. Mia listened to both adults with the same focused attention she brought to her street corner conversations, occasionally asking questions that revealed wisdom beyond her years. When Leonard described how guilty he felt about the possibility of moving forward without Margaret, Mia nodded gravely and said, "But moving forward isn't the same as moving away from somebody. Sometimes moving forward is how you carry them with you to new places. By the time Rosa and Mia prepared to leave, several hours had passed without Leonard noticing. The sun had begun to set over Lake Michigan, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that he had admired from his windows countless times, but somehow hadn't really seen in months. As he watched Rosa help her daughter gather their belongings, Leonard felt something that might have been contentment, not happiness exactly, but a sense of rightness that he had feared was lost forever. "Thank you for coming," he said as they waited for the elevator. "This is the first time my house has felt like a home since—" He let the sentence trail off, but they all understood what he meant. "Thank you for inviting us," Rosa replied, and Leonard could see that her initial suspicion had been replaced by something warmer. "Mia was right about you. You're sad, but you're not mean, and you're trying to get better. That takes courage." As the elevator doors closed, Leonard felt both grateful for the afternoon they had shared and already anticipating their next encounter. For the first time in 2 years, he had experienced genuine pleasure in human company, not the calculated networking of business relationships, but the simple joy of connecting with people who saw him as a person rather than a portfolio or a problem to be solved. Over the following weeks, Leonard's visits to Mia's corner became a regular part of his routine. Sometimes Rosa would join them, and gradually their conversation moved beyond the superficial pleasantries of acquaintances to the deeper exchanges of people who were becoming friends. Leonard began to learn about their daily struggles, Rosa's exhausting work schedule, Mia's challenges at school, where her unique perspective sometimes made her the target of teasing, the constant financial pressure that shaped every decision they made. In return, Leonard found himself sharing stories about his own life that he had never told anyone, not just the public narrative of his business success, but the private struggles with feeling worthy of love, the pressure of being responsible for other people's financial security, the way wealth had gradually isolated him from authentic human connection even before Margaret's death. These conversations took place not in conference rooms or therapeutic offices, but on street corners and in coffee shops, in settings where pretense felt impossible and honesty was the only currency that mattered. Leonard began to notice changes in his physical environment that paralleled the shifts in his emotional landscape. The clocks throughout his penthouse, which had remained stopped at 3:47 a.m. for 2 years, suddenly seemed oppressive rather than commemorative. One morning, he found himself winding them again, allowing time to resume its forward movement through his space. The sound of ticking that had once felt like violence against Margaret's memory now sounded like evidence of life continuing, of moments building toward something new rather than simply accumulating in meaningless succession. The windows that had been sealed against the outside world began to open, allowing fresh air to circulate through rooms that had been preserved in artificial stasis. Leonard started eating meals at different times and in different locations, breaking the rigid routine that had structured his days since Margaret's death. He began to play music again, not the classical pieces that Margaret had loved, which still felt too emotionally charged, but jazz and blues that seemed to match his gradually shifting emotional landscape. Most significantly, Leonard started to engage with his wealth differently. Instead of viewing his financial resources as a fortress protecting him from further loss, he began to consider how they might be deployed as tools for connection and positive change. He researched charitable organizations serving families like Rosa and Mia's, not from the detached perspective of someone looking for tax advantages, but from the engaged perspective of someone who had developed personal relationships with people affected by poverty and immigration challenges. One particularly cold November afternoon, when Lake Michigan's gray waves seemed to mirror the steel-colored sky, Leonard arrived at Mia's corner to find her missing from her usual post. Rosa was there instead, her face tight with worry and exhaustion that spoke of a crisis Leonard didn't yet understand. "Mia's at home," Rosa explained when Leonard asked about her daughter's absence. "She's been sick for a few days, but this morning she could barely get out of bed. I keep telling myself it's just a cold, but—" She let the sentence hang unfinished, filled with the fears that all parents carry about their children's vulnerability. Leonard felt something cold settle in his stomach, not just concern for Mia's health, but a familiar terror of losing someone he had grown to care about. The rational part of his mind knew that children got sick all the time and recovered without serious complications, but grief had taught him that the worst outcomes were always possible, that love offered no protection against loss. "Have you taken her to see a doctor?" Leonard asked, trying to keep his voice calm despite the anxiety that was rising in his chest. Rosa's expression revealed the complicated calculus that shaped every decision in her life. "The clinic downtown has a sliding scale, but I'd have to miss work to take her, and if I miss work I might lose the job. And without the job," she gestured helplessly, caught in the impossible choice between immediate medical care and long-term financial survival. "Let me help," Leonard said without thinking. "I can call my doctor. He makes house calls for serious cases. Or I can drive you to the best hospital in the city. Whatever you need." Rosa's pride warred visibly with her maternal instincts. Leonard could see her struggling with the implications of accepting help from someone whose resources so vastly exceeded her own, weighing the potential cost of owing favors against her daughter's welfare. "I don't want charity," she said finally. "Mia and we take care of ourselves." "It's not charity," Leonard replied, though he wasn't entirely sure what to call it instead. "Mia has given me something I couldn't buy at any price. She helped me remember how to feel human again. If she needs medical care, then providing that care isn't charity. It's gratitude." The distinction seemed to matter to Rosa, offering her a way to accept assistance without compromising her dignity. After a few more moments of internal debate, she nodded agreement, and Leonard immediately pulled out his phone to contact his personal physician, Dr. Elizabeth Harrison, whose concierge medical practice served Chicago's wealthiest families with the kind of personalized attention that money could buy. Dr. Harrison agreed to see Mia that afternoon, and Leonard arranged for his driver to transport Rosa and her daughter to the medical office in a building that Rosa had probably never had reason to enter before. As they traveled through the city, Leonard found himself praying, not to any specific deity, since his relationship with organized religion had been complicated even before Margaret's death, but to whatever forces in the universe might be listening, that Mia would be okay. The medical examination revealed that Mia had developed pneumonia, a serious condition that could have become life-threatening if left untreated, but was highly manageable with proper medication and care. Dr. Harrison prescribed antibiotics and recommended several days of rest, along with a follow-up appointment to ensure that the infection was clearing properly. As they left the medical building with prescriptions and instructions for Mia's care, Leonard felt relief so intense it was almost physically painful. "Thank you," Rosa said quietly as they waited for Leonard's driver to bring the car around. "I don't know how I can repay you for this." "You don't owe me anything," Leonard assured her. "But if you want to do something for me, just let Mia get better. That's all the payment I need." During the week that followed, while Mia recovered at home, Leonard found himself missing her presence more than he had expected. Their daily conversations had become such an integral part of his routine that her absence felt like a significant loss. But more than missing her company, Leonard was terrified by the reminder of how fragile human connections could be, how quickly someone important could be threatened by circumstances beyond anyone's control. To distract himself from worry and to channel his nervous energy in a productive direction, Leonard threw himself into research about children's health care in Chicago's underserved communities. What he discovered was both heartbreaking and infuriating. Thousands of families like Rosa's were forced to choose between medical care and basic financial survival on a regular basis. Children's illnesses went untreated, not because the medical knowledge didn't exist, but because the economic barriers to accessing care were insurmountable for working families without health insurance. For the first time since Margaret's death, Leonard felt genuinely angry about an injustice that had nothing to do with his personal loss. This anger was different from his grief. Instead of turning inward and creating isolation, it pointed outward toward action and engagement with problems that affected people he cared about. Leonard began to understand that his wealth could be more than just a buffer against the world's dangers. It could be a tool for addressing systemic problems that caused unnecessary suffering. When Mia was finally well enough to return to her street corner, Leonard was waiting with Rosa to welcome her back. The little girl looked thinner and paler than before her illness, but her smile was as radiant as ever. The first thing she did was offer Leonard a hug, as if she sensed that he had been worried about her and needed reassurance that she was truly recovering. "I missed you," Leonard said, surprised by how easily the admission came. In his business world, expressing emotional attachment was often viewed as a strategic weakness. But with Mia, honesty felt both natural and necessary. "I missed you too," Mia replied matter-of-factly. "But while I was sick, I had lots of time to think about things, and I figured out something important about you." Leonard braced himself for one of her characteristically insightful observations. "What did you figure out?" "You're ready," Mia said simply, as if this explained everything. "Ready for what?" "Ready to start helping other people the way you helped me when I was sick. Ready to stop being sad alone and start being helpful with other people." Mia's assessment was delivered with the confidence of someone announcing a scientific discovery. "You've been practicing feeling things again, and now you're good enough at it to use your feelings to help fix problems for other kids like me." Leonard stared at her, once again amazed by her ability to articulate insights that he hadn't quite reached himself. But as soon as she said it, he knew she was right. Something fundamental had shifted during the week of worrying about her health. His grief was still present, but it was no longer the only significant emotion in his life. He had rediscovered his capacity for caring about people and problems beyond his personal loss. And with that rediscovery came a sense of purpose that had been absent since Margaret's death. "What kind of help do you think I should start with?" Leonard asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. "The kind that makes it so other kids don't get as sick as I did just because their mamas can't afford doctors," Mia replied without hesitation. "The kind that makes it easier for families to take care of each other without having to choose between medicine and food." Her answer revealed that despite her young age, Mia understood perfectly the economic calculations that governed her family's daily life. She had probably been aware during her illness that receiving medical care represented a financial burden as well as a health necessity. And she had processed that knowledge with the same clear-eyed acceptance she brought to all of life's complexities. Over the following days, Leonard found himself thinking constantly about Mia's suggestion that he was ready to help other families facing challenges similar to Rosa's. The idea was both exciting and terrifying. Exciting because it offered him a sense of purpose and direction that had been missing from his life for years. But terrifying because it would require him to engage with the world in ways that might make him vulnerable to loss and disappointment again. Leonard began to spend his evenings researching pediatric healthcare initiatives, reading about successful models for providing medical services to uninsured children, and consulting with experts about the most effective ways to address systemic barriers to healthcare access. His business skills, which had been focused for so long on maximizing profits and market share, proved surprisingly applicable to analyzing charitable organizations and identifying opportunities for strategic philanthropic investment. But as Leonard delved deeper into the world of nonprofit organizations and social services, he discovered something that bothered him profoundly. Many of the existing charitable programs seemed designed more to make donors feel good about themselves than to create sustainable solutions to complex problems. Gala fundraisers where wealthy attendees spent more on their outfits than most families earned in a month, organizations with administrative overhead that consumed the majority of donated funds, and initiatives that provided temporary relief without addressing underlying systemic issues. Leonard realized that if he was going to commit his resources to helping families like Rosa and Mia's, he wanted to do more than just write checks. He wanted to create something new, something that would provide lasting change rather than temporary band-aids. The prospect of starting his own foundation was daunting, requiring him to navigate legal and regulatory frameworks he had never studied, but it also felt like the most meaningful challenge he had undertaken, since building his original technology company. As winter settled over Chicago and Mia's corner became increasingly uncomfortable for extended conversations, Leonard invited Rosa and Mia to begin meeting at his penthouse on a regular basis. What had started as occasional visits evolved into weekly gatherings that became the highlight of Leonard's week. They would share meals that Rosa insisted on contributing to, despite Leonard's protests, and engage in conversations that ranged from Mia's observations about human nature to Rosa's stories about life in El Salvador, to Leonard's growing plans for establishing a pediatric healthcare foundation. These gatherings transformed Leonard's home in ways that went beyond the physical presence of guests. The penthouse, which had felt like a museum for so long, began to show signs of actual habitation. Toys appeared in the living room when Mia visited, art supplies accumulated on the kitchen table, and the refrigerator was stocked with foods chosen to appeal to a child's palate rather than simply meeting nutritional requirements. The space that had been frozen in time gradually began to reflect the reality of ongoing life rather than commemorating a life that had ended. Leonard also began to notice changes in his physical condition that seemed to correlate with his emotional transformation. The chronic pain that had plagued him since the car accident was still present, but it no longer dominated his consciousness to the same degree. He found himself sleeping better, eating with more appetite, and feeling energy levels that had been absent for months. His physical therapist commented on improvements in his mobility and strength that couldn't be entirely explained by their exercise regimen alone. Most remarkably, Leonard began to experience moments when he forgot about the wheelchair entirely, periods when he was so engaged in conversation or so focused on planning his foundation that his physical limitations receded into background awareness rather than defining his every interaction with the world. These moments were brief, but they offered glimpses of a future where his identity might be determined by what he could contribute rather than by what he had lost. One snowy December afternoon, as they sat around Leonard's kitchen table working on a puzzle that Mia had brought to share, Rosa made an observation that caught Leonard off guard. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "you look different than when we first met. Not just healthier, but like you're living inside your body again instead of just carrying it around." Leonard considered her words, realizing that she had identified something he felt but hadn't been able to articulate. For months after the accident and Margaret's death, he had experienced his body as a burden or limitation, something that prevented him from moving through the world the way he wanted to. But gradually, through his connection with Rosa and Mia and his growing sense of purpose, his body had begun to feel like home again rather than a prison. "I think I'm remembering how to belong in the world," Leonard replied, surprised by his own insight. "For a long time, I felt like I was just observing life from outside, like I was watching other people live while I was stuck behind glass. But now I feel like I'm participating again." Mia looked up from the puzzle piece she'd been examining. "That's because you stopped trying to protect yourself from caring about things. Caring about things is scary because you might lose them, but not caring about anything is scarier because then you lose yourself." Another moment of wisdom from someone who hadn't yet reached double digits in age, delivered with the same casual authority she brought to all her observations about human nature. Leonard had grown accustomed to these insights, but they still had the power to surprise him with their accuracy and depth. As Christmas approached, Leonard found himself facing holiday traditions for the first time since Margaret's death. Previous years had been exercises in survival, getting through December 25th with minimal acknowledgement that the date had any special significance. But this year felt different. Leonard wanted to mark the holiday, not because he had recovered from his grief, but because he had companions to share it with who made celebration feel possible again. Leonard invited Rosa and Mia to spend Christmas Day at his penthouse, offering to prepare a traditional holiday meal despite his limited cooking skills. Rosa initially protested that she couldn't accept such an expensive gift as Christmas dinner in a luxury apartment, but Leonard convinced her by explaining that their presence was the gift he needed most, the opportunity to practice gratitude and generosity instead of spending another holiday alone with his memories. Christmas morning dawned clear and bitterly cold, with Lake Michigan partially frozen and snow covering the city in pristine whiteness that made even the industrial areas look magical. Leonard had spent days preparing for Rosa and Mia's visit, not just by planning the meal, but by decorating his penthouse with Christmas lights and a tree, the first holiday decorations his home had displayed since Margaret's death. When Rosa and Mia arrived, carrying homemade cookies and a small wrapped gift that Mia had crafted herself, Leonard felt something that might have been joy. Not the intense happiness he had shared with Margaret, but a quieter satisfaction born of connection and purpose, and the knowledge that he was no longer spending the holidays in isolation. The day unfolded with the relaxed pace of people who had nowhere else they needed to be. They prepared the meal together, with Mia insisting on helping despite her limited cooking skills, and Rosa gently correcting Leonard's attempts at traditional holiday dishes. The kitchen filled with laughter and conversation, and the kind of comfortable chaos that comes from multiple people working toward a common goal. When they finally sat down to eat, Leonard found himself thinking about gratitude in ways that went beyond the conventional holiday themes. He was grateful not just for the food and the company, but for the journey that had brought them together, the series of coincidences and choices that had led a grieving millionaire to befriend a girl who sold hugs on street corners. The path from his initial skepticism to this moment of shared celebration seemed both unlikely and inevitable. After dinner, they exchanged gifts in Leonard's living room while snow continued to fall outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. Rosa had given Leonard a scarf that she had knitted herself, explaining that she had noticed he never seemed warm enough during their outdoor conversations. The scarf was beautiful in its simplicity, but its real value lay in the hours of work it represented and the thoughtfulness of someone who had paid attention to his comfort. Mia's gift was a painting she had made at school, a watercolor portrait of Leonard sitting in his wheelchair but surrounded by sunshine and flowers and birds. The artistic skill level was exactly what one would expect from a 9-year-old, but the emotional content was sophisticated. She had painted him not as someone defined by limitation or loss, but as someone connected to beauty and life and possibility. Leonard's gifts to Rosa and Mia were more materially valuable, but offered with the same spirit of attention and care. For Rosa, he had arranged enrollment in English classes at a local community college, along with childcare for Mia during those hours. For Mia, he had purchased art supplies and arranged for private lessons with a local artist who specialized in working with gifted children. Both gifts were designed to support their goals and interests, rather than simply displaying his financial resources. But the most meaningful exchange of the day wasn't material. As they sat around the decorated tree, with hot chocolate and the remains of their Christmas dinner, Mia asked Leonard a question that had clearly been on her mind for weeks. When you start your foundation to help kids like me get medical care, can I help? I know I'm little, but I'm really good at talking to people and explaining things, and I understand about being scared to go to doctors and stuff like that. Leonard felt his throat tighten with emotion. The idea that Mia wanted to be involved in his philanthropic work hadn't occurred to him, but as soon as she suggested it, he realized how perfect it would be. Who better to help design programs for children than someone who understood their perspective from the inside? I would love your help, Leonard said seriously. In fact, I think the foundation needs someone like you to make sure we're creating programs that actually work for the families we want to serve. Would you be willing to be our first junior consultant? Mia's face lit up with excitement and pride. Really? I could have a job helping other kids? Really, Leonard confirmed. And not just because I want to give you something to do, but because you have insights and understanding that I don't have. You know things about being a child in a struggling family that no amount of research can teach me. As Christmas Day came to an end, and Rosa and Mia prepared to return home, Leonard felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with the holiday itself. Something fundamental had been restored to his life, not his old existence with Margaret, which was gone forever, but a new way of being in the world that honored his loss while still allowing for growth and connection and purpose. That night, as Leonard sat alone in his penthouse looking out at the city lights reflected on the lake's frozen surface, he realized that his grief had transformed without disappearing. Margaret's absence was still a daily reality, but it no longer felt like an insurmountable obstacle to engagement with life. Instead, his love for her had become a foundation for loving others, a reminder that connection was both precious and fragile, and therefore worth the risk of loss that inevitably accompanied caring. The new year began with Leonard throwing himself into the practical work of establishing his foundation, with an energy and focus he hadn't experienced since the early days of building his technology company. But this project felt different from his previous business ventures. Instead of being driven by competition or profit margins, it was motivated by a genuine desire to solve problems that affected real people whose lives he had grown to understand and value. Leonard spent weeks meeting with lawyers and accountants and non-profit consultants, navigating the complex legal requirements for establishing a charitable foundation, while also developing programs that would actually serve the needs of families like Rosa and Mia's. The process was sometimes frustrating, requiring him to learn entirely new regulatory frameworks and organizational structures, but it was also deeply satisfying in ways that his previous success had never been. True to his promise, Leonard involved Mia in the planning process from the beginning. Their meetings became working sessions where her insights shaped every aspect of the foundation's approach. Mia helped develop intake procedures that wouldn't intimidate families seeking help, suggested locations for clinics that would be accessible to the communities that needed them most, and provided feedback on communication materials to ensure they were written in language that children and non-native English speakers could understand. Rosa also became involved in the foundation's development, bringing her perspective as both a parent and someone who had navigated multiple social service systems as an immigrant. Her practical knowledge of the barriers that prevented families from accessing existing programs proved invaluable in designing services that would actually reach the people who needed them most. By spring, the Leonard and Margaret Blackwood Foundation for Children's Healthcare was ready to open its first clinic in the neighborhood where Rosa and Mia lived. The facility was designed to feel welcoming rather than institutional, with bright colors and comfortable furniture and play areas where children could wait without feeling anxious about medical procedures. The staff included bilingual medical professionals and social workers who understood the economic pressures that shaped their patients' lives. The grand opening of the clinic was a modest affair. No black-tie fundraisers or society page coverage, just a simple celebration with the families and community leaders who would be served by the facility. Leonard spoke briefly about the personal experiences that had motivated his commitment to children's health care, acknowledging Rosa and Mia as the inspiration for everything the foundation hoped to accomplish. But the most moving moment of the day came when Mia cut the ribbon to officially open the clinic, wearing a dress that Rosa had made for the occasion, and beaming with pride at her role in creating something that would help other children. As the ribbon fell away and families began to tour the facility, Leonard felt a sense of accomplishment that had nothing to do with financial returns or market success and everything to do with the knowledge that his resources were finally being used to create genuine positive change in the world. In the months that followed, Leonard watched the clinic serve hundreds of children who might otherwise have gone without medical care. Each success story, a child's asthma brought under control, an infection caught and treated before becoming serious, a family freed from choosing between rent money and prescription medications, felt like a small miracle that justified all the effort and resources that had gone into creating the program. But Leonard's transformation wasn't limited to his philanthropic work. As his sense of purpose expanded beyond his personal grief, he began to experience changes that surprised even his medical team. The chronic pain that had plagued him since the car accident wasn't entirely gone, but it had become more manageable. His energy levels increased noticeably, and his sleep improved to the point where he rarely needed the medications that had been essential for months. Most remarkably, Leonard began to regain mobility that his doctors had considered permanently lost. At first, he could stand for brief periods while holding onto furniture or his wheelchair for support. Then, he could take a few steps with the aid of a walker. By summer, he was using a cane for stability, but walking considerable distances under his own power. His physical therapist was amazed by the recovery, noting that while some improvement had been expected, the extent of Leonard's regained function exceeded all medical predictions. Leonard understood that his physical healing was connected to his emotional transformation, though he couldn't explain the mechanism by which grief and isolation had apparently contributed to his physical limitations. What mattered wasn't the medical explanation, but the lived reality. As he had learned to engage with life again through his connection with Rosa and Mia and his commitment to helping other families, his body had somehow remembered how to heal itself. The first anniversary of Leonard's meeting with Mia passed quietly, but meaningfully. Instead of marking the date with fanfare, Leonard and Mia returned to the street corner where they had first encountered each other. The neighborhood had changed subtly in the intervening months. The clinic's presence had attracted other businesses and services, creating a small hub of community activity where none had existed before. As they stood on the familiar sidewalk, Leonard reflected on the journey that had brought him from isolation and despair to engagement and purpose. The changes in his life were so fundamental that his previous existence seemed like something that had happened to someone else, not because he had forgotten Margaret or stopped grieving her loss, but because his grief had evolved from something that paralyzed him into something that motivated him to create meaning from suffering. "Do you ever regret it?" Mia asked, interrupting his introspection with a question that seemed to come from nowhere. "Regret what?" Leonard asked. "Letting yourself care about me and Mama and all the kids at the clinic and stuff like that. Because caring about people means you might lose them, and losing people really hurts. So sometimes I wonder if maybe it would be easier to just not care about anybody." Leonard considered her question seriously, recognizing the sophisticated understanding of risk and vulnerability that it contained. At 9 years old, Mia was already grappling with existential questions about whether love was worth its inevitable cost. "I used to think that way," Leonard admitted. "After my wife died, I tried to protect myself by not caring about anyone else, and it worked in a way. I didn't experience any new losses because I didn't form any new connections. But the protection came at a price. I stopped experiencing joy, wonder, satisfaction, hope, all the emotions that make life worth living. I was safe, but I wasn't really alive." "So you think it's better to risk getting hurt again than to be safe but empty?" Mia asked. "I think love is what makes us human," Leonard replied. "And losing people we love is the price we pay for having the privilege of loving them in the first place. I can't control whether the people I care about will be taken away from me, but I can control whether I allow fear of loss to prevent me from caring about anyone. And I've learned that a life without love isn't really protection. It's just a different kind of death." Mia nodded thoughtfully, seeming to file away his answer for future consideration. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the familiar rhythm of neighborhood life continue around them. Parents pushing strollers, children walking home from school, elderly residents sitting on stoops and observing the world with patient attention. "I'm glad you decided to risk it," Mia said finally. "Because if you hadn't, you wouldn't have learned how to be my friend, and I wouldn't have learned how to help other kids through the foundation, and none of the children at the clinic would have gotten the medical care they needed." Leonard smiled, realizing that Mia had articulated something he had been feeling but hadn't quite been able to express. His decision to open himself to connection again hadn't just benefited him personally. It had created ripple effects that extended far beyond his individual healing. By allowing Rosa and Mia into his life, he had discovered a way to transform his grief into a force for positive change that was helping numerous other families facing similar challenges. As the sun began to set over Chicago, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded Leonard of the first sunset he had really noticed in his penthouse, he felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought him to this moment. Not gratitude for Margaret's death, which remained a source of sadness that would probably never completely disappear, but gratitude for the way human connection had allowed him to find meaning and purpose in the midst of loss. The foundation continued to grow and expand its services throughout Leonard's remaining years. Additional clinics opened in other underserved neighborhoods, serving thousands of children who might otherwise have lacked access to medical care. The program became a model for other cities, demonstrating that strategic philanthropic investment could create sustainable solutions to systemic problems rather than just providing temporary relief. Leonard lived to see Mia graduate from high school with a scholarship to study medicine at Northwestern University, fulfilling her dream of becoming a pediatrician who could serve communities like the one where she grew up. Rosa eventually returned to school herself, earning a degree in social work and joining the foundation's staff as a family advocate who helped other immigrant parents navigate complex systems of medical care and social services. But perhaps more importantly than any external measures of success, Leonard lived his final years with a sense of peace and purpose that had seemed impossible during those dark months after Margaret's death. He never stopped missing his wife. Her photograph remained prominently displayed in his home, and he continued to speak with her memory during quiet moments of reflection. But his grief had transformed from a paralyzing force into a source of compassion and motivation that enriched his relationships with everyone around him. Leonard passed away in his sleep at the age of 78, surrounded by the extended family of friends and colleagues and community members whose lives he had touched through his foundation work. At his memorial service, hundreds of people gathered to share stories about the ways his generosity and compassion had affected their families. But the most moving tribute came from Mia, now Dr. Mia Rodriguez, who spoke about the street corner where they had first met and the hug that had changed both their lives forever. As people filed out of the memorial service, many of them stopped to embrace each other, inspired by Mia's reminder that human connection, however brief or unlikely, had the power to heal wounds that seemed unhealable and create hope where none had existed before. Leonard's legacy lived on not just in the institution he had created, but in the countless relationships and acts of kindness that rippled outward from his decision to allow love back into his life, despite the risk of future loss. And you, have you ever met someone who changed your perspective on love and loss so fundamentally that you barely recognized yourself afterward? Have you discovered that the very thing you're most afraid of, opening your heart again after devastating loss, might actually be the path to healing you never knew existed? Tell me your story in the comments below. If this story reminded you that human connection can transform grief into purpose and isolation into community, please leave a like and share it with someone who needs to remember that love is always worth the risk. Subscribe to hear more stories about the unexpected ways that ordinary people become extraordinary healers in each other's lives. Because sometimes salvation comes not from great gestures or miraculous interventions, but from the simple willingness of one person to see another person clearly and offer them exactly what they need most.